world tells us that everything depends on the art of the deal, the bargains and the negotiations. Give us your rare metals and we'll give you weapons. Put tariffs on our goods and we'll do double back to you. From the beginning, people have traded what they had for what they wanted, haggling over the best deal with threats or sweeteners as required. Power and wealth come from being good at that game. Humans tend to imagine the gods as basically bigger versions of us. These mighty ones hold all the cards and they don't give us something for nothing. They're hard to please and easy to offend. Offering valuable resources and praise and loyalty attracts their favour. People who neglect such things can expect trouble. You do what you can to stay on good terms with the powerful ones who can influence your life. When you feel inadequate and guilty, as we often do, it's easy to suppose that God is just waiting to chastise us. Our model of the divine is based on our experience of life. It's really all we've got to go on. We look for signs of God's will in events, trying to find insights about God's purposes. Reality doesn't interpret itself. We have to do that work. We observe and ponder, joining the dots as best we can, making imaginative connections from our own experience and hoping for hints and revelations from God. The idea that God is rather like us and willing to negotiate gives us a sense of safety and control. If we do right, God will bless us. If not, we try to refine our understanding. What is God teaching me through this setback? How can I change my ways so it doesn't happen again? That's something you can hear every day among believers of many faiths. And many a Christian leader strongly endorses that transactional idea of pleasing God to obtain good results. Paul talks about the consequences of sin in the Old Testament stories as being a lesson for his own generation. Those sacred stories are relevant and remembered and repeated to train our moral sense and show us how to live as God's people. In the Hebrew scriptures, we see this enormous, complex picture developing over many centuries. From Abraham onwards, the key idea is that God chooses a community to bless. God offers a deal, a covenant between God and the people, coming entirely from God's grace rather than anything the people can offer God. God inspires prophets to guide the community, commending what's right and warning of consequences of wrongdoing. God is shaping them into a just and enlightened community, a sort of a model village as an example to the world, if they will just honour God and keep the law. The covenant is all for our benefit, to draw us towards God, the only source of life and goodness. If we reject that covenant, we're cutting off the branch we sit on, and trouble is sure to follow. But the picture of a straightforward deal that protects the chosen doesn't take enough information into account. It's hardly news that bad things do happen to good people, and the wicked often do get away with it. How do we make sense of a God who controls everything, and yet lets horrible things happen to those he promised to bless? Often those things come from human wrongdoing, but not always. If God could make things better, why doesn't he? Does God not care? Is God punishing us? Or is God simply unable to intervene? This is the age-old, agonising question. Faithful believers are encouraged to trust God for their safety, and yet they still suffer. What do we make of all that? The ancient book of Job explores this dilemma. Job, a virtuous man, suffers disasters. His pious friends assure him that he must have sinned, or God wouldn't have allowed that to happen. Job rejects that explanation and demands a reply straight from God. God's reply is deeply mysterious, confirming that these high matters are way beyond our simplistic human reasoning. Our first reading today tells us that God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. Whether we see it or not, the prophet assures us that all God does is with love and generosity, weaving together infinitely complex factors for the good of the whole creation. We miss the point entirely if we're weighing up what each party gets out of the deal or dreading punishment if we don't toe the line. That calculating, fearful way of thinking, even if it is reflected in the scripture stories, is basically human experience projected onto God. Even ordinary human love is more generous than that. That ancient scriptural theme, an angry, punishing God, is, though, always side by side with a completely opposite and equally ancient and sacred theme. God is merciful, forgiving, infinitely tender and loving. When Jesus speaks with authority about the God he knows intimately, when he models God to us, we hear practically nothing about God's vengeance on sinners. Jesus reveals God to us as pure love, always ready to forgive and reconcile, lifting up the humble, healing and restoring. Jesus' critique is entirely towards the pompously self-righteous who think they stand high in God's favour and despise the weak and needy as outcasts from God's circle. So, when Jesus is asked about the cause of a horrible act of Roman violence and a disaster where a building collapsed and killed people, the awful question bursts out: why did that happen? Was God punishing them for sin? To a pious person, that's a legitimate conclusion, well founded in Scripture. And we may suspect a judgmental tone there. Those people were surely worse than us, so we needn't worry about sharing their fate. Jesus' reply throws down that whole tottering structure of cause and effect. That human reasoning trying to make sense of the stuff that happens has joined the dots up wrong and arrived at a distorted idea of God. Those victims, he says, sin no more than anybody else. Tyrants will murder and accidents will happen. This is not God's doing at all. But he adds, disaster can strike anybody. The necessary thing is to be turned towards God, to be seeking God with trust and desire, opening ourselves to see as God sees and living accordingly. Then the dread of judgment and the terror of death will not rule our lives. In the parable, the impatient, ruthless man who wants to rip up the tree because it's not paying its rent is surely not a figure of God. Surely the figure of God is the gardener who wants a second chance, who's prepared to put a lot of effort into making it work better. And the impatient landowner is more like a figure of what the world tells us. God always offers another chance, patience and care rather than destruction. Even when we think we're a disappointment and expect the worst, God does nourish and tend us constantly, inviting us to produce more and better fruit. Jesus didn't live in the shadow of death the way we do in our culture, avoiding, denying, living in morbid dread. He's indifferent to power and wealth. His identity was grounded in the living and creative presence of God, and he was serene in the acceptance of his own coming death. One who doesn't fear death threatens the powers in his culture because he shows up the hollowness of their claims to control. He doesn't play those games. He shows those who follow him how little they need to worry when they're confident in God's love. It's this grounding that enables Jesus to overcome the powers of violence and death, letting them do their worst without diminishing him in the slightest. This is the way of the cross that he calls us to share with him. There's a wonderful line in our first hymn today, speaking of the Galilee hills, where Jesus knelt to share with thee the silence of eternity interpreted by love. The silence of eternity interpreted by love. I love that. We picture Jesus alone in his prayerful communion with God, aligning himself to share God's vision. Reality doesn't interpret itself. Eternity is silent, and we read our own meanings into it. So what's the key to make sense of human experience? Looking out for our own advantage and accumulating wealth and power, as the world constantly tells us to? But the key with which Jesus interprets reality is his deep, constant experience of God's love. All that matters to him, all that controls his life, is that God's love should be known and shared, freeing us from fear and leading us into life. Following Jesus and the way of the cross reveals our true identity, not as lost sinners ripe for punishment, but as beloved children of God. This is the faith of our baptism, which James has come to share today. May he and we always turn from the ways that would lead to perishing and live in the freedom of God's love every day of our lives.